Good morning, everyone. I am Wayne Treadwell. I'm the Senior Systems Engineer. I've been working in Channel for 4 years here at Jamf, and prior to that I worked 13 years at Apple doing strategic deployment programs for Apple, so I'm happy to be here. It's a dangerous thing to give me a microphone and 45 minutes, so I'll be your stand-up this morning, and hopefully you all had a great party and are ready to engage this morning on some cool topics here. So today's session, simplifying a modern approach to deployment for eSIM. So just to get right into it, I'll advance right into it. Let's start with some of the basics. What is the primary purpose of a SIM card? What role does it play? Typically, when we're thinking about the cellular network, of course we're familiar with the phone. We know we've got the SIM card, we've got the cell tower, but what really is the SIM card doing in this transaction? This were probably 10, 15 years ago when we had, early smartphones or feature phones. We might have said that we're going to store some contacts on there, or maybe we're going to put some really low-resolution photos on there. Those are days long gone, of course. So the SIM card isn't going to do it for that. But the primary focus for the SIM card is really to decrypt the carrier network for you, so you can get onto the network, to identify the subscriber to the network, right? We get you the right rate plan, all of that sort of stuff. And of course, you've got a device, so we want to identify that device as well. And the SIM card helps to make sure that you as a subscriber and your device are properly authenticated and ready to go as far as the network is concerned. So let's also just take a quick look at the history of a SIM card and see where we've come and where this plays into eSIM. So it really started around 1991 as the introduction of the SIM card. As you can see in the rendering here, the original SIM cards were about the size of a credit card. And you might remember from visiting stores, cell phone stores, kiosks from years past, getting a SIM card that you'd punch out of what looks like a credit card size. Well, that was the original size of the SIM card. And then as we move on into the early 2000s, we have the micro, and then around 2010, the mini SIM, and then finally the key innovation, the nano SIM. So really in the intervening 35 years, let's call it, since the introduction of the SIM card, the biggest innovation in technology we have is trimming away excess plastic from that. The actual chip has really not changed. The core function is the same. So what are we going to do? How are we going to bring this into the 21st century, help us take advantage of some of the technology we have? Well, that's where we enter into the role of eSIM. So especially in modern smartphones, you take Apple Silicon, we can embed what is essentially a few kilobytes of data onto the device, onto the silicon. We can put it in a protected storage container where we download the requisite information, protect it, and use that to activate the device. And we don't need to have the physical SIM card. So this is the 21st century approach. But you might ask yourself, we've had 35 years with the SIM card. Why do we need to focus on eSIM, and why now, right? Why is that change taking place? Well, to do that, let's go back and let's look at the iPhone. Let's look at the device. And if we were to have our X-ray vision on and we were to take a look inside of the device, what we would see is a densely packed network of circuitry, circuit boards, of course, camera networks, battery, all of this sort of stuff. There in yellow is the packaging and the SIM tray and the SIM card. That's what it takes up. It's roughly about 10% of the volume. It's important to remember that it's not just the plastic card. It's also the tray. It's the packaging that the tray needs to go into and the physical connectors that need to touch the SIM card itself. So if this can be removed, it's possible for Apple, for a cell phone manufacturer, to reclaim that space. And if we're looking at this is like Manhattan real estate, right? It is a dense, packed network of high-value real estate, and that's sitting on 10% of it. So, if the manufacturer can reclaim that, there's a lot of benefits that can be brought forward to advance the device. So let's just take a look at some of those potential benefits. When I authored this was in around August. It was before the launch of the iPhone 17 series of phones. Apple was actually much, much more aggressive on this point than I was. I said about 30 minutes of battery. They say if you look at the physical SIM version versus the eSIM only version of the iPhone 17 Pro, there's an additional 2 hours of battery life. I was conservative and said 30 minutes. That's a massive user benefit to not having that physical packaging there. You could also, in theory, add an additional camera, next generation of GPU, CPU, louder speakers. I mean, the list could go on for benefits that could be real-world benefits for end users. So this is really what's driving this, right? The density of the device is increased. Everybody's looking for more space in the device without necessarily making it thicker, wider, bulkier than it needs to be. So that's really the drive for eSIM these days. So now let's take a look at what it looks like to transition, the transition to eSIM, particularly from an organizational perspective. And to do that, let's first look at what some of the pros and cons are to a physical SIM versus eSIM. So it's a universal standard. It's been around for 35 years. Every device that's out there, every carrier network supports a physical SIM. So there's undoubtedly is a standard. It's easy to switch. You know, you want to switch your phone from carrier to carrier. We'll put an asterisk with other potential issues there around contracts and things, but you can, the portability it was acceptable there for physical SIM. That leads to this perception of no carrier lock-in. I can, you know, again, if I'm not on contract or things like that, I can move from phone to phone, carrier to carrier, and I don't need to worry about that. That leads also to the perception of control for the end user, and also good for emergency scenarios. You can imagine a scenario where somebody's traveling and maybe they carry a couple of SIM cards with them in case, you know, they're traveling in an area where they don't have great reception. They could maybe move from carrier to carrier. So these are kind of been lauded as the pros for physical SIM. On the cons, kind of obvious, it's a physical thing. It could be lost or stolen. From an organizational perspective, it's a hands-on approach, right? It's a physical thing that someone has to exchange in and out of the device. The aforementioned space that it takes up, and when it comes to the core data on the SIM card, it's hard-coded. So if we want to make changes, we need to kind of get a new SIM card. So that's really not a great thing. So let's take a look also with eSIM. Of course, there's no physical SIM card needed. It's easy to activate. I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, so I'll skip past that. There's no issues of durability, of course, because it's a file. It's living on the device. So as long as the device is able to power on and continue on, then you're good to go. Saves space. We talked about that. Better for travel. Shout out Anthony's here and also Jamie from One Global. They have an amazing story around travel and eSIM. I will shout out to those sessions later on, but definitely worth checking out if you've not been to the One Global booth. And remote management. That's really one of the big key features that we're introducing or is being introduced with eSIM. So then here on the con side of things, the adoption of a standard, so okay, we need to do work there, right? We're coming up against the physical SIM card. eSIM needs to be an equivalent standard. Deployment in bulk, right? For those worried about organizational deployment of eSIM, we need to solve for that. And of course, the everyday workflow that every organization faces, which is the return to service or the break-fix operation, we need to solve for those aspects as well. So one of the things that's really interesting, if we take a look now back at the cons for a physical SIM and we look at the pros for eSIM, we start to notice something, that really in eSIM, we've solved for every one of the cons. So the physical, the no need for lost or stolen, the dynamic activation, we do that over the air now, saves the space, remote management with a couple of extra thrown in here around the durability and the travel use cases. So let's take a look at the concerns, because you're saying to me, okay, well, yeah, we have some cons, Wayne, for eSIM, so let's address those. Well, let's do it. So here they are again, and let's take a look. Very first one is the adoption of a standard. Well, I'm happy to say that as of June 2024, which is the most recent data I could get a hold of, eSIM was in 123 countries worldwide, and it was supported by 441 carriers. These are either national, global players, or they're regional carriers or the MVNO, or the mobile virtual network operators that exist out there in the world. So that is a pretty wide swath. And this is just US and Canada. But if you look at this list, and if you're familiar with US carriers, you're going to know all the big names are there, all the sort of secondary players, if you will, are there. And these folks are all supporting eSIM. We could go down the globe, but we would be here all day for that. I will also shout out that I have some attached resources, a download for this session, which has some of this information from a global perspective in there as well. So I think we can say we have an adoption of a standard pretty much, probably let's say 98% solved for, or maybe a few laggards or holdouts there, but I think we can say we've done it. So we have these other two aspects, which is the bulk deployment piece. Well, for bulk deployment, for new out-of-the-box deployments, Apple has us covered with a system they call the Carrier Activation and Provisioning System. This isn't a consumer-facing system or process. This is with carriers. Carriers sign up with Apple. Apple works with them to implement their technology to help deliver eSIM on initial boot to the device. So they're working in collaboration with the carrier. So that's wonderful. That means out-of-box scenarios for eSIM, new devices. That should be pretty self-explanatory for those carriers that are participating. And what I will say there is, again, going back to that documentation, I have a link in the documentation for globally which carriers are participating. Apple keeps that resource updated on a regular basis. And actually, that list I showed you from US and Canada, those aren't just carriers that are supporting eSIM, those are carriers that are participating in the activation and provisioning system, so it's fairly widely adopted already. So thank you, Apple, you're helping us out with that first step. But it begs the question, what do we do when we need to redeploy these devices or outside of a scenario where we're deploying them for the first time? Well, I get to say, you're at JNUC, I get to say that's where Jamf Pro gets to help you. Jamf Pro has the ability to work with the carrier as well, to grab an eSIM profile and deploy to the device in what I call eSIM to the last mile. And what that means is the carrier will always be responsible for assigning a phone number, making sure the rate plan, all of that stuff is assigned to the devices, to the organization. They will create an eSIM profile, and then Jamf Pro to the rescue to help IT and administrators take care of eSIM at the last mile. Of course, it could be halfway around the globe, so I just mean the last mile from the perspective of the last chain of deployment. So let's take a look at what this looks like. And for those of you who are astute, you'll notice that our Jamf Pro cloud has been joined by another amorphous blue cloud with a very catchy name called SM-DP+. What is that? That is the carrier eSIM server. Every carrier has at least one. They either run this themselves or they might work with a third party. They might have multiple. But this is a dedicated carrier server that allows Jamf Pro to integrate with it. This is a standard from the folks at the eSIM standard board. And we can integrate with this. We can reach out to that server. We can grab the eSIM profile. And let's take a look at what this looks like. So on the left here, we have our administrator. He's in the console. We're looking at one device, right, for eSIM distribution. Admins in the console, you know, they've dialed into the particular device, they've gone into the management settings, and hey, they're going to trigger this remote command here for refresh cellular data. What that does when it's triggered is it sends a command through Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro reaches out to the SMDP+ server. We then get an eSIM profile that gets returned back to us, and we then push that eSIM profile back down to the device and install it over the air. So this is wonderful. This is a way that Jamf Pro can help you distribute out eSIM profile, but I'm showing you this here at one device. Of course, you know in organizations you have way more than one device, so how do we do that? Well, we can leverage the power of smart groups and static groups to reach multiple devices. Because of course, when you're in the smart group as an example, you can choose the action button and you can leverage the exact same refresh cellular data command to push that same command out across the devices that are listed in that group, helping us achieve a mass deployment of eSIM in bulk. So this is a way that Jamf Pro can help us beyond an initial out-of-the-box configuration to make sure that as you move forward, you can imagine a scenario where maybe some percentage of the population in your deployment is already deployed and we're on physical SIMs, and now you want to get them on an eSIM. This is a scenario where Jamf Pro can help you do that. So finally, we have this return to service aspect. So if we look at this, let's take a look here. We've got an administrator. Probably the best way to do this would be using one of Apple and Jamf's return to service workflows. We're going to keep it real basic. We're in the portal. We've been working with a user. We've determined that for one reason or another, the device needs to be wiped. So we're going to go ahead and send that wipe command. And let's take a look at what happens here. We send the wipe command over the device reboots. It starts back up to the hello screen. And our service set indicator from the carrier is gone. We've lost our eSIM profile. So now as an IT person, I have an extra task on my hands. I need to get service back to that device. And that means I'm probably going to have to call the carrier or push a ticket to get a new eSIM provision so that we can go through the workflow we described before. So that's not really, in this particular case, what IT intended to do. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to go back to the same wipe workflow. And this time, when you click on wipe inside of Jamf Pro, you will see that checked there, it's the default now, is retain cellular data plan. And you guessed it, what it's doing when we send that particular version of the wipe command, we reboot again, we go to the hello screen, and our carrier service set indicator is still there. We wiped the device, we wiped all of the bits we don't care about, but we left the eSIM intact. That means we're not left in a scenario where the device doesn't have service after we've reset the device. So that's really what we're aiming for here. So if we were to call these, for the sake of this discussion, let's call these 3 different distinct eSIM commands. The first one is that refresh cellular data command. That allows us to go out, reach out to the SMDP Plus server, grab a fresh eSIM profile and install it on the device. Second is the retain cellular data plan, and I added wipe down there as well, a standard wipe command. That's because in some instances that is the right move, and I don't mean to imply that it should always be retain cellular data. If folks are maintaining buffer pools and they want to keep some subset of devices, they don't necessarily want to keep that device active with a subscription plan, they can go ahead and wipe the device. It will remove the eSIM, and at a later date and time, the device can be re-provisioned when it's going to be handed out. So that may be a proper workflow. These join the cellular restrictions that we have. These are restrictions that apply both in a SIM context, but as well as an eSIM context. And let's just run through these real quickly. Some of you are probably familiar with what these are, but modify eSIM settings. So here's an example where a primary phone number has been established. We can apply this restriction, and that will prevent changes in those instances. The transfer of eSIM, this is really great for consumers because, of course, they're not using MDM. They need a method to migrate eSIM, but it's probably not what we want in an organization, right? We're paying for maybe the phone, maybe we're paying for an eSIM plan. We don't necessarily want to see that eSIM plan transferred from device to device. So if we leverage this in all the various spots in iOS where you can migrate that, that will be blocked from migrating. Now, this one here, the preserve eSIM on erasive device. How does this differ from what I showed you before, where we're retaining the cellular data plan? Well, the retain cellular data plan is administrator triggering this action. This is a restriction that in instances where the end user still has the privilege to erase all content and settings on their own, the administrator can make the election here to remove this last option here, which is in this context here, if they were to have erased all content and settings, the eSIM would be gone. The administrator can say, well, you can still erase your device, but I always want the eSIM to be intact. So this will allow us to make that sort of change there. And modifying cellular data plans, this would be scenarios where maybe they're trying to install an additional eSIM or a physical SIM in phones that are compliant. We can prevent those sort of changes as well. And then finally, you'll know if you've been in the cellular settings that you can set on a per app basis the privilege to access the cellular network. This is a restriction that would block changes to that once they've been configured. So these are the return to service workflows that we've got. So I think we can say we've got that solved. But let's take a look at some other considerations. So we've kind of solved for the cons for eSIM. Let's just look at what some other considerations are. First off, let's break this out into two workflows. In IT, you're probably familiar. You have the new device scenario, and then you have an existing device. And these often in many workflows are the way that things are broken out. So let's take a look at the new device scenario. And the good news is, thanks to Apple, there really aren't any other considerations for you to think about from a deployment perspective. What I will say is behind the scenes, obviously the carrier needs to participate in the carrier activation program. Again, shout out to the handout for this session, and definitely check that out. That's a dynamic document that Apple's keeping up to make sure if you're deploying, particularly in another country or you have global responsibilities, you can make sure that that's being covered. The carrier on the background is attaching in a carrier identifier. That could be the IMEI, the ICC ID, or the EIEIO number to what we're calling the EID, which is the eSIM identifier. So that's really what's happening on the background. And then, of course, the device needs to be able to uptake that. So it needs to be, of course, powered on. It needs to be able to get some kind of a signal. So there's not much to think about there. It's really taken care of as long as the carrier is participating in Apple's carrier activation program. So let's take a look at an existing device. Few other caveats here. Again, with Jamf Pro, we can help solve for many of these workflows, but there are some things that are kind of I got yous, or could be I got yous, and they are the following. Are the devices carrier locked? So carrier locked generally revolves around a contractual obligation. Maybe that somebody organization signed a 3 or 4 year contract, something like that, and so they're time-based from moving devices, or maybe there's some financial commitment they haven't taken care of. That would place the device in a carrier lock status, at least here in the United States. If the device is blacklisted, so this could be, that's sort of a black box, the blacklisted, what would get a device blacklisted. But usually it's something where the device is acting abnormal on a network. Maybe they think there's some malicious activity, and the device is, okay, we're gonna block that device. And or if it's lost or stolen. The lost and stolen piece, this is not activation lock. Of course, that would be, that could potentially be an issue as well, but shout out to probably other sessions here. They're talking about many of our features to solve for those problems. Or lost mode, we're talking about them being reported to the carrier as lost or stolen. These are the kinds of things that would prevent an eSIM profile from being created. That being said, there's nothing different about these potential I got yous from a SIM perspective. However, it's probably going to be more noticeable in an eSIM context, because in a physical SIM environment, somebody has to provision an eSIM. They have to physically get a card and hand that out. And if they're running into one of these problems, they're not going to be able to do that. And somebody's going to be missing a SIM card. eSIM, because it's sort of transparent, it's happening in the background, it's possible that it might be a little opaque and that you're not necessarily seeing what's going on. So these are a great thing to be aware of that will help you sort of block and tackle, especially if you're doing a transition to eSIM on already deployed devices in the field. What can you do about it? Work with your carrier, grab the list of the IMEI, ICC ID numbers, and work with them to see if any of these conditions are in place. That will help you do either one of two things: either identify the issues, the devices that have a potential issue, you can set those aside, or work with the carrier to get those resolved so that obviously they can be transitioned, which is probably the goal in an operation like that. So with that being said, I have just one final slide for you all here, and that there has been more here at JNUC. Anthony's here in the audience. I know Jamie is also here from One Global. They've done some wonderful sessions to talk about all the various aspects. They have a wonderful story, particularly around travel and using Jamf Pro to automatically provision SIMs as well. They have a session here, best practices for eSIM on iPhone and iPad. Definitely recommend, if you didn't get a chance to check out those sessions, One Global is going to be here through the rest of the JNUC today. And also, we will be making these sessions available online, so I would definitely highly recommend that you take up on those sessions. So with that, I'll say thank you to everybody, and we'll take it for any Q&A if there is any.
Thank you. I've got a mobile mic here that I'll bring if anybody's got any questions.
Any questions?
I have one. Sorry, I missed the beginning, so excuse me if you've covered this, but for BYOD devices, so for example, I work in a hospital with hundreds of physicians who want to use their own device, but they're always on call. We have a single number for the on-call number, and the idea of sharing that without sharing the phone, being able to transfer that back and forth, is that a possibility?
You're wanting to restrict that, or you're wanting to enable that?
We're wanting to enable that. So on like personal devices, but a controlled eSIM, moving back and forth, like the on-call docs, for example.
You want to assert the eSIM in certain scenarios and then sort of suppress it in others?
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah, I think that that right now is something that I think architecturally, in terms of your ability to automate that, is not necessarily there today. Of course, the user can do that, but I think your question is around the control for the administrator to be able to time that.
That, and then potentially that same number on that eSIM moving from a phone to phone different times a day or different days, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a next level of eSIM. Certainly, you'd have a similar challenge with a physical SIM counterpart, but yeah, those abilities are not there for that level of administrative control. Of course, Apple's enabled that for the end user to make choices about when a particular number or SIM is being utilized, but that has not surfaced yet for the administrator.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Good question.
Hi, I have a question about the transferring eSIM control in Jamf. Let's say the scenario is the user gets an upgrade. So they're not necessarily transferring their eSIM, but they're activating a new line. If we turn off the ability to transfer eSIM, would the user then be prohibited from activating their upgraded device?
Yeah, the standard protocol from a setup assistant perspective would be to walk through a process to use the built-in mechanisms for eSIM transfer. So that could be a scenario where maybe you, so let's just step back and think about that from problem-solving perspective. You could create a smart group where you dynamically assign users based on the fact that you know that they're getting upgrades, and maybe in that smart group, they're removing that restriction temporarily, and then afterward, the devices are falling out of scope for that group, and then you could reinstate that. Or if you're working with the carrier and you have the carrier is providing the eSIM, you could go in on a bespoke basis and use the commands we showed here to refresh cellular data for that particular device and do the update from an administrative perspective.
So at NASDAQ, so everyone kind of orders their own phone. They can receive it at their home and activate it. Like, they don't need to call IT to get it activated. So we want to keep that process, but also secure the devices and not have the ability for anyone to just grab that eSIM from them.
Yep, if you're looking to automate that, I think the use of smart groups and building smart groups that will scope in for new devices that, not yet have eSIM identifiers. So as part of one of the attributes in Jamf Pro now, you will see that for creating smart groups, you have EID as an attribute. So you would have a null value, right, for a new phone. It would not have an eSIM. So you, in that instance, that phone, until it has a value, you could go ahead and sort of lift the restriction that you typically would have, and then once it gets the eSIM installed, it would have the restriction placed on it, and that would allow you to continue that workflow if I'm understanding how you guys are distributing.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Great question. Wonderful. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed JNUC so far, and I hope whatever remains, you guys have a great session. Hopefully you all had a great party last night, and JNUC's been awesome for you. And just want to thank everyone for joining the session today.
Thank you, Walter.